Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really significant historical event, the resurrection of Jesus.
Right. And we're not just going to look at it purely from, a faith perspective.
Exactly. We're using this method, it's pretty fascinating, called the minimal facts approach. Okay, so what is that?
Well, basically, imagine you've got this, ancient puzzle, lots of disputed pieces.
Okay.
The minimal facts approach says, okay, let's just push aside the debatable stuff for a minute. Let's focus only on the historical points that almost everyone agrees on.
Even skeptical scholars.
Yeah, even the skeptics.
Yeah.
The idea is to build a case sort of from the ground up using only these widely accepted facts.
Got it. So our mission today is to see what we can, confidently understand about the resurrection just by sticking to these historical anchors. We'll be looking at historical scholarship, non-biblical sources too.
Precisely. It's like laying a foundation. You don't start with the paint color, right? You start with the concrete. The solid stuff almost all historians acknowledge.
Makes sense.
Then we ask, okay, what best explains this foundation?
Right. And for the resurrection, scholarship points to about 5 of these really solid, minimal facts, foundational pieces.
That's the core of it.
So we're going to explore them. First, Jesus' death by crucifixion. Second, the discovery of the empty tomb. Third, the disciples' belief, their absolute conviction that they saw the risen Jesus and how that just changed everything for them.
A massive transformation.
Fourth, the conversion of Paul. I mean, this guy was actively persecuting Christians. Bit of a head-scratcher, that one.
Definitely needs explaining.
And fifth, the conversion of James, Jesus' own brother, who was skeptical at first. So these 5 points, that's our deep dive.
Let's jump in.
Okay, fact 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. This one's, well, it's pretty much universally accepted, isn't it?
It really is. It's the bedrock. Almost impossible to deny historically, even if you doubt everything else about him.
What's really striking is the non-Christian evidence.
Yeah, the number of independent sources is compelling. We're not just talking the New Testament here.
Right. You've got Josephus, the Jewish historian in the first century. He clearly mentions Jesus being crucified under Pontius Pilate.
Yep. And then there's Tacitus, the Roman historian.
In his annals, right.
Exactly. He talks about Christ's execution by Pilate. It's a Roman source discussing a Roman punishment. Very matter of fact.
Okay, who else?
Well, there's Lucian of Samosata. He was a Greek satirist, kind of making fun of Christians. But he mentions their founder being crucified. It's like an offhand comment, but it confirms the event.
So even ridicule confirms it.
Inadvertently, yeah. And Marabar Serapion, a Syrian philosopher, wrote this letter mentioning the unjust killing of a wise king, which most scholars think is clearly about Jesus.
It's interesting how these sources, often with no Christian agenda, sometimes even hostile,
they all point to the same core event, execution by crucifixion.
And even the Jewish Talmud, though compiled later, contains traditions acknowledging his execution, even if they explain it differently.
Right, so the external evidence for the crucifixion itself is really, really strong.
Okay, so that's fact 1, pretty much locked down. Let's move to the second minimal fact, the empty tomb. Now, this one has maybe slightly less universal agreement.
You're right. It's not quite at the same level as the crucifixion in terms of near universal scholarly consensus, but it's still accepted by a lot of critical scholars, a significant majority, actually, and the historical arguments are pretty persuasive.
Okay, like what?
Well, one big one is what some call the Jerusalem factor.
The Jerusalem factor, tell me more.
Think about where the message, "He is risen, the tomb is empty," first started.
In Jerusalem.
Exactly. The very city where Jesus was publicly executed and buried. Now put yourself in the shoes of the authorities there, the ones who wanted him dead.
Okay, they wouldn't have been happy about this message.
Not at all. So if the body was still in the tomb, what's the easiest way to shut down this whole resurrection rumor immediately?
Produce the body.
Right. Just wheel it out. Show everyone. End of story. The fact that they didn't, despite having every motive and opportunity, strongly suggests the tomb was, in fact, empty.
That is a powerful point. It would be hard for that message to get any traction if the counter evidence was right there.
Precisely. And then there's something called enemy attestation.
Okay.
We actually have records showing that even early critics of Christianity acknowledged the tomb was empty. They didn't deny that.
So what do they say?
Well, they offered alternative explanations, like the classic one, the disciples stole the body. But notice, even in trying to explain it away, they concede the basic point.
The tomb was empty. Wow. So even the opposition confirms that part.
It's quite telling. And another point, which is really interesting contextually, is the testimony of the women.
Ah, yes, the Gospels say women were the first ones there.
Right. Now, in first century Jewish and Roman culture, women's testimony wasn't considered, well, particularly reliable in legal settings. It was a very patriarchal society.
So if you were inventing a story to convince people,
why would you make your key initial witnesses the least credible kind of witnesses in that culture? It seems counterproductive, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. Unless
you were simply reporting what you genuinely believed happened. It has this ring of authenticity because it's kind of embarrassing or awkward detail to include if you're just making it up.
Okay. So, strong case for crucifixion, compelling arguments for the empty tomb. Let's get to the third minimal fact, the disciples. Their claim to have seen the risen Jesus and the transformation that followed.
This is where things get really dramatic.
Yeah.
Even highly skeptical scholars generally agree on this. The disciples genuinely believed they had seen the risen Jesus.
They weren't lying about their belief.
Right. Whether they were right is the question, but their sincerity isn't usually doubted. Just look at their behavior before the crucifixion. They're scared, they scatter. Peter denies even knowing Jesus.
Total fear and confusion.
Absolutely. But then, just a short time later, these same guys are boldly, publicly proclaiming the resurrection, facing beatings, imprisonment.
A complete 180-degree turn, from hiding to fearless proclamation. And it wasn't just one person.
No, it was a group experience. A shared conviction that fundamentally changed them. And this leads to the point about their willingness to suffer and die.
Martyrdom.
Yes. We have multiple ancient sources, maybe 7 or so, some non-Christian, attesting that many of the apostles suffered intensely and were killed for this specific claim, that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them.
That's intense. People might die for beliefs they think are true, even if they're mistaken.
Exactly. But people generally don't willingly, knowingly suffer torture and death for something they know is a lie they themselves concocted.
Right. That level of commitment, facing death, it speaks volumes about how convinced they were by whatever it was they experienced.
It suggests a profound, deeply held conviction rooted in what they perceived as reality.
Okay. Powerful stuff. Now, fact 4, Paul's conversion. This one's always struck me because he wasn't just indifferent, he was actively hostile.
Fiercely hostile. Saul of Tarsus, as he was known then, was a Pharisee, deeply committed to Jewish law, and he saw this early Jesus movement as a dangerous heresy.
So he persecuted Christians.
Vigorously. He was involved in hunting them down, arresting them, maybe even consenting to executions like Stephen's. This isn't just from Acts. Paul talks about his own past as a persecutor in his letters.
And these letters are considered very early and authentic, right?
Absolutely. Some of the earliest Christian documents we have, widely accepted by scholars. And in these letters, he describes this dramatic event on the road to Damascus.
The encounter with the risen Jesus, as he described it.
Yes, an experience that just completely flipped his world upside down. Suddenly, this chief persecutor becomes arguably the most influential apostle and missionary for the very faith he tried to destroy.
That kind of U-turn. It's hard to explain naturally, isn't it? What could cause such a radical shift in someone like that?
That's the million-dollar question. Paul himself attributed it solely to encountering the risen Christ. Naturalistic explanations, hallucinations, psychological breaks, they struggle to account for the content of his new belief, his immediate coherence, and his lifelong dedication.
And like the other apostles, he didn't exactly have an easy life after converting.
Not at all. He faced constant opposition, shipwrecks, beatings, imprisonment, and ultimately, tradition holds strongly, martyrdom in Rome. All for this belief that started on the Damascus Road.
From persecutor to persecuted apostle, willing to die for it. It's another piece of this puzzle that demands explanation.
A very significant piece.
Okay, that brings us to the 5th minimal fact, James, Jesus' own brother. And he wasn't on board initially, was he?
No, the Gospels are pretty clear that during Jesus' earthly ministry, his own brothers, including James, were skeptical. They thought he was maybe a bit out there.
Beside himself, one Gospel said.
Right. Family skepticism, understandable, perhaps. But then, after the crucifixion, something changes radically for James, too. Well, Paul gives us a crucial, very early piece of testimony in 1 Corinthians 15. He lists resurrection appearances and specifically says Jesus appeared to James.
Ah, so a personal appearance is cited as the reason by Paul, writing quite early.
Exactly. And this appearance seems to be the catalyst. this formerly skeptical brother becomes not just a believer, but a central pillar of the early church.
A leader.
The leader of the Jerusalem church, which was the mother church at the time, a position of immense importance and authority.
From skeptic to leader of the whole movement in its home city. That's quite a shift.
It's huge. And again, mirroring the others, James's story doesn't end there. We have historical accounts of his martyrdom as well.
Outside the New Testament.
Yes. Josephus, the Jewish historian we mentioned earlier, actually describes James's execution by the Jewish authorities around 62 AD. Other early writers like Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria also record his death for his faith in Jesus.
So, the skeptical brother not only converts and leads, but also dies for this belief. It's hard to imagine what could cause that kind of change in a family member, short of something incredibly powerful and convincing.
It really strains credulity to think he'd go through all that, overcoming initial skepticism, becoming a leader, facing martyrdom based on anything less than a profound personal conviction rooted in experience.
Okay, so we've laid out the 5 minimal facts. Crucifixion, empty tomb, disciples' transformation and willingness to die, Paul's conversion, James's conversion. Each one pretty well supported historically. Now, the big question you prompted earlier, so what? What does it all mean when you put these pieces together?
Well, this is where the minimal facts approach really shows its strength. It's about the cumulative case.
Not just looking at each fact in isolation.
Exactly. While you might try to cook up some alternative naturalistic explanation for maybe one of these facts.
Like maybe the disciples hallucinated, or maybe someone stole a body, or maybe Paul had a psychological issue.
Right. You can try those. But the challenge is finding one single explanation that can plausibly and coherently account for all 5 of these historically established facts simultaneously.
And that's where the alternative theories tend to fall short.
That's the argument many historians and philosophers make. Yes, theories like the disciples stole the body. Okay, maybe that explains the empty tomb, but it makes their willingness to die for a known lie completely bizarre. Hallucination theory. Maybe explains the appearances, but not the empty tomb, and group hallucinations of that specific nature are problematic. Swoon theory, Jesus just fainted, doesn't fit the Roman crucifixion practice or his later vigorous appearances.
It's like trying to fit square pegs into round holes for all 5 facts at once.
Pretty much. No single alternative theory seems to adequately explain the entire package. The death, the empty tomb, the sincere belief and transformation of the disciples, the radical conversion of a persecutor like Paul, and the conversion of a skeptic like James.
So back to so what? If these facts are solid, and the alternatives don't really explain them altogether,
then we have to ask, what does explain them all? And the explanation offered by the earliest Christians themselves, the one that seems to tie all these threads together most effectively,
is the resurrection.
That's the contention. That the actual resurrection of Jesus provides the most historically coherent and comprehensive explanation for this specific cluster of well-evidenced facts. It accounts for the empty tomb, why the disciples were transformed and willing to die, why Paul flipped 180 degrees, and why James went from skeptic to leader and martyr.
So it's presenting the resurrection not just a matter of faith, but as a potential historical inference based on the agreed-upon evidence.
Exactly. It provides an intellectual historical foundation that you can examine. It doesn't compel faith. Faith always involves personal trust and commitment, but it offers a strong basis for concluding that the core Christian claim is rooted in actual historical events.
It moves the discussion to the realm of historical inquiry, using evidence that, well, even critics often concede.
Precisely. It allows for a different kind of conversation about the origins of Christianity.
Well, this has certainly been a fascinating deep dive. To quickly recap those minimal facts: Jesus' crucifixion, widely attested; the empty tomb, with strong arguments like the Jerusalem factor and enemy attestation; the disciples' genuine belief in seeing the risen Jesus, leading to their radical transformation and willingness to die; Paul's shocking conversion from persecutor to apostle, also ending in martyrdom; and James, the skeptical brother, converting, leading, and also facing martyrdom. Quite a collection.
It is, and the challenge really for anyone looking at this evidence is to find an alternative explanation that makes better sense of all those facts together than the resurrection hypothesis does.
That's definitely the provocative thought to leave everyone with.
Yeah.
Given this historical evidence, this cluster of facts that even critical scholars often accept, and the difficulty of finding another explanation that fits them all, what does that imply? How might that shape how you understand history, belief, and the start of Christianity? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.